Hi, we continue in Genesis 21 with one of the most horrific, excruciating scenes in the entire book. Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness with a skin of water and a little bit of bread, expecting they're going to die of thirst in the desert. But if our previous scene started with joy with the birth of Isaac and then turned dark with Sarah seeing Ishmael doing something that led her to tell Abraham to cast them out, this scene today starts dark but ends up positive with the promise of God that Hagar and Ishmael will be saved, and that Ishmael will be the father of a nation and will bear 12 princes. So the reversal that we find here redeems Hagar and Ishmael, but not in the eyes of Sarah and Abraham, who don't ever see either of them again. And so, as we enter into the story, a number of things that I want to be paying attention to. I noted in the last video, not the art video, but the one on the last scene, 21:8-13, a number of non-white minoritized scholars who were attempting to see if they could find something in these stories that gave them something positive. In other words, is this simply a bad portrayal of God and a racist or ethnically prejudicial portrayal of Hagar, or is there something that non-white, non-majority people can find in this that gives some hope? And I'm not going to try to stand in their place, nor am I going to try to go through all those articles and the people that I mentioned last time. You can read those, and I'd like to have them speak for themselves. My task here, as I understand it, is to help us hear the text, and then you can decide, depending upon your own social location, whether it's something that gives you hope or not. So as we go through this, I want to remember using Pickett's chart, and we've used a number of Susan Pickett's charts here, the very precise parallels between Hagar and Ishmael here in chapter 21 and Abraham and Isaac in the next chapter. And you see all those parallels. I won't go over them in great detail, but it really highlights that Hagar in relationship to Ishmael here is precisely parallel to Abraham's relationship with Isaac. I won't post it again now, but I posted another chart from Pickett that showed the parallels more broadly between Hagar and Abraham. And there's also another one between Hagar and Moses. Here they are in the desert by a bush as one example. And so Hagar, interestingly, has a very prominent position for a woman, and especially for a non-Israelite woman, and not a member of the Holy Family, if you will, that descends through Abraham, like Isaac and Rebekah and those that follow. So the text raises her up in precisely the way that Sarah tries to tear her down by simply calling her a slave girl. And so we'll focus on the positive aspects, and then we'll see the parallels next time as we go. As we've been looking at this chapter, we're now on to the second chiasm. We saw the chiasm earlier of the birth, and now there's this chiasm here, and we'll continue all the way to the end of this scene here, because then it'll go back to Abimelech, which fits the chiasm that I've been showing, into which the 5 scenes in these 2 chapters, 2 chapters, 20 and 21, go together. I'd also like to look back before we enter into our immediate scene, the previous scene with Hagar in chapter 16. And I've color-coded a number of parallels so you can see those. So in both, there's an angel. Here it's the angel of Yahweh, and the other is the angel of Elohim. And that has led older scholars to see this as a doublet, as 2 versions of a similar story based on different sources. But modern scholars have rejected that, and there's no need to see it that way. It certainly fits within the narrative that there are 2 separate incidents that are being described. But they are certainly parallel as well. They both have angel appearing to Hagar, and we'll look in a moment at angels in Genesis and beyond, Genesis throughout, beyond this scene. There's water, here the spring of water, and here there's the well of water. The angel asks Hagar a question: what troubles you, Hagar, or for where you come from, or where are you going? The angel also speaks to her positively about the future of Ishmael. Multiply your offspring that can't be counted, and I will make a great nation. There's an element about seeing here, and there's an element about hearing the cry, here giving heed to your affliction, here hearing the voice of the boy, and the wilderness parallel on both sides. So there's certainly parallels here between the pregnant Hagar in the wilderness and Hagar with her son Ishmael in the wilderness, as we'll see. So let's begin to look at our story, and then we'll pull up some of our other resources. So after God has told Abraham that Ishmael will become a nation, and that would lead him to have some hope that Ishmael will live even if he doesn't see him again, he rose early, and we looked earlier at the scenes of rising early. You can find that on the web page for radicalbible.net. Rose early in the morning. Here it links with the story in the next chapter in 22, where he rises early to take Isaac off, and took bread and a skin of water. And this is one of the first things that shocks readers, because we know that Abraham was rich already, all the way from back back to chapter 12 when Pharaoh gave him slaves and animals. He was rich. But in the scene that was part of this section at the beginning of chapter 20 with Abimelech, with the second wife sister story, he was not only given more animals and more slaves, but he was given 1,000 pieces of silver. And so he's totally rich. And the idea that he would send a woman who he's had intimacy with, and they've been in relationship now for 16 or 17 years, let's keep that in mind. This group has lived in their small context, certainly in a tent of some kind, closely together for all this time. And we know that he loves Ishmael. It was powerfully evil in his eyes that Ishmael would be sent out, and yet he gives them meager provisions that would certainly not last them very long. What a contrast with the great feast he put on just in the previous scene at the weaning of Isaac, and of course the feast for the complete strangers in chapter 18. So he treated strangers and his young child Isaac much better than he's treating people who it's said he cares about, and there's no stated reason why, but it's a dark scene. Bread and a skin of water. The word for skin of water, hemeth, is only in this scene in the Hebrew Bible, probably of goat skin, and Wenham estimates here that it would hold 3 gallons and weigh about 30 pounds, which is pretty heavy to carry on your shoulder, but of course that wouldn't last long and it wouldn't keep them going for very long. Note, in light of the Deuteronomy scene, we don't know if the authors of Genesis know Deuteronomy, but to the extent that Deuteronomy was from before exile, from the time of Josiah, they certainly would. And we see this here about when slaves are set free, you are not to send them out empty-handed, but provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your wine, because you are a slave. But Abraham wasn't a slave, so he doesn't have that memory. And we don't know that Abraham knows Deuteronomy, but the audience certainly does. So the standard that God sets before the Israelites is to be generous to slaves who are being sent off, but Abraham is not that. And he gave it to Hagar, and she's named Hagar here by the narrator, putting it on her shoulder. And there's something tender, at least, about that, although it's not clear whether he put the water on the shoulder or the child. But most scholars agree that it's the water, especially along with the child following on that. The word for shoulder is Shechem, and it echoes the garment that Noah's sons put on him to cover him after the flood story, along with the child, and sent her away. And that's the last he's going to see of them. And it's really quite a dark scene. We'll look at some artistic images of that in just a moment. And she departed, literally she just went off. And as my note below says, homeless because of the unwillingness of the father of her child to shoulder the responsibility, Hagar was abandoned. And so she departed and wandered. And the word for wandered is what we heard earlier when Abraham told Abimelech that the gods had set him wandering. And as Cohen notes, in the rabbinic tradition, in his words, the one wandering in the desert is out of sync with the order established at creation, is into this maelstrom that Hagar is thrown. And so elsewhere we see, like in 37:15, it's Joseph, where this word shows that he was lost, wandering, and that's what she is. Wandering about in the wilderness of Beersheba. The first locale since Gerar, when Abraham and Sarah had settled. Let's look a little bit at this here. So first, this is the first reference to Beersheba. And before I show the map, let's look at Beersheba here. So the first reference here, and then we'll see it on the next scene as describing the place where Abimelech and Abraham swore an oath. This is the town of Beersheba, but the wilderness of Beersheba, as we'll see, is not very far away. And then Abraham lived at Beersheba. Did he see Hagar there? We don't know. Isaac goes up to Beersheba in chapter 26, and then it's described as named in chapter 26, called Beersheba after he called it Sheba. That's Isaac calling it that, connected to water, because it means a well of the seven. Beer for well and Sheba for seven. Then Jacob was in Beersheba, and then Jacob under the name Israel came to Beersheba after, at the end, this is after he's been in Egypt with his son Joseph, and then he sets out from Beersheba with his family. Elsewhere, we see other important people there. Throughout the rest of the monarchy story in the Deuteronomistic history, we hear the description from Dan to Beersheba, which is different from Dan to Bethel, which comes out elsewhere. But Dan to Beersheba, and we see that in Judges and Samuel and in Kings, and also a similar one in Amos. But we see in 1 Kings that Elijah came to Beersheba to flee for his life, so it becomes a place of sanctuary for him. But not for Josiah, who in his so-called reform, where he's destroying everything that expresses worship of any god, including Yahweh, that's not taking place in Jerusalem, he defiled the high places from Geba to Beersheba, Geba probably being Gibeah, the place of King Saul. In Nehemiah, it talks about the people of the land, the people who aren't named as the exiles who returned, but the people who stayed during the Babylonian exile, and villages encamped from Beersheba to the valley of Hinnom. And then finally in Amos the prophet in Yahweh's name speaks, do not seek Bethel, do not enter to Gilgal, or cross over into Beersheba. Gilgal shall go into exile, and Bethel shall come to nothing. Although it doesn't say anything about Beersheba, this is all symbolic of rejecting monarchy. So Beersheba is first mentioned as associated with Hagar here, but it will be associated with all the patriarchs as well as prophets like Elijah. So a very important place that's first connected with her. So let's look at Beersheba. Oh, I'm sorry, I just looked at that. Let's look at the Google map so we can see something of what the wilderness of Beersheba would look like. And there you see the little town as it is now. But it's a pretty stark place. And some of the art we'll look at in a minute really highlights the starkness of that. So she's going out there. There's nobody else around. And she's certainly expecting she's going to die. And however long it takes to drink the 3 gallons of water or so, there's no apparent well in the vicinity. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. What a hideous scene this is. The word for casting here, shulak here, is used with Joseph and his brothers and then the Hebrew babies in Exodus 1. So it's definitely a throwing of life away. And as Grossman says below, other narratives that describe people being cast off intend to express unique violence and deliberate annulment of humanity. And as my note below says further, her action is a final attempt to preserve his life through the mercy or interest of a passerby. This from Jansen, that quote and the following from Jansen and Noble. And they say, we must assume that the practice of child exposure and abandonment had been embedded in everyone's consciousness as one possible parental stratagem in extreme situations, which is to say that maybe somebody more generous will come along or somebody with water will come along and save her child. And notice here it's described as a child, a hayeled, which is what leads some scholars and some artists to see this as a small child and would suggest that the child is on her shoulder, not the bag. But we know Ishmael to be 17 years old, as my note below says, 13 years from the time he was born till the pregnancy, and then the year of awaiting Isaac's birth, and then 3 years till he was weaned. So Abraham is now 103, and he was 86 when Ishmael was born. Under one of the bushes. And as Jansen and Noble again highlight, this suggests a strategy of seeking water, because if there are bushes, that would mean there's some source of water to water the bushes. So she's hoping maybe there's groundwater or something near there. But then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off. And notice how much detail the narrator has here to describe this distance between them. And it uses an interesting metaphor that we'll look at more closely in just a second here. She went and sat down opposite him, and that shapes the chiasm we see on the right side of the screen, a good way off. Hagar here, only one other time in Genesis as distance, but interestingly about the distance of a bow shot, using a unique word teshek here, the first word, but then keshet for the bow shot. The first one is for distance, and then for the bow shot. It was used in the rainbow story, but it'll also be used for Esau's weapons, figuratively around Joseph. But we'll see it more importantly connected with 21:20, where Ishmael is a kashet, only there, so he's a bowman. So it's part of the chiastic parallel as well, as we see, although this is actually, it's not, because this is outside the chiasm. For she said to nobody in particular, and it doesn't seem like a prayer, although perhaps it is addressed to God, but it doesn't say so explicitly, do not let me look on the death of the child. And that's about the most poignant thing one can imagine here. And any reader who's not sympathetic to Hagar at this point and not wondering what happened to Sarah, the matriarch, really is not have much of a heart or has so much prejudice against anybody who are the non-Israelite ancestors as to not be able to feel. But certainly anybody who has any feeling here can certainly feel the suffering here of Hagar at the thought of watching her young child die. And as she sat opposite him, the New Revised Standard here says she lifted up her voice and wept, but the Septuagint has the little boy cried out, and Westerman suggests following the Septuagint, since the next verse tells us that God heard the voice of the boy and not her. But it could work either way. She could lift up her voice and weep, but the boy also voice could be heard, so it doesn't have to be one way or the other. The weeping here is the first weeping in Genesis, and she's the only weeping woman in the entire Bible, Hebrew Bible at least. There's Mary Magdalene weeping in the New Testament, but not in the Hebrew Bible. So again, Hagar in important company here, connecting with Mary Magdalene. And then it turns around, and the narrator again follows Hagar's plight, and we see the little ABA chiasm here around the voice of the boy. So the voice, God heard the voice of the boy, and the hearing. Notice the play on words, because Ishmael means El hears, or God hears. So Elohim heard, Shema El. So we see Ishmael in there. And we see other times of hearing the voice or obeying the voice, and it also echoes in Exodus, God hearing the voice of the Israelites crying out and sending Moses. One of the parallels between Hagar's context, at least, and Moses, if not between them directly. So heard the voice, and we hear call for voice a number of times in Genesis. And the angel of God called to Hagar. It can simply be from the sky. It doesn't have to be from heaven, suggesting some metaphysical other realm. Shemayim means the sky. It's where the rain and things come from, and we don't know of any metaphysical realm in the minds of Genesis people. So the angel of God, again calling her by name, Hagar, from the sky, said to her, in the New Revised Standard, what troubles you, but it's more vague in the Hebrew, like what to, or almost like what's up, although not with that kind of casual sense. As scholars have noted, it's a formulaic introduction to what follows. And notice both the narrator and the angel refer to as Hagar. She's no longer the slave girl as she was in the last scene. Do not be afraid. And we've seen do not be afraid elsewhere. The only other woman who will be told not to be afraid is Rachel. So again, Hagar in important company. Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy. An exact repeat there for this little chiasm that's in this little section. And then the instructions of what to do next. Starting in verse 18 here, as Jansen and Noble continue, the instruction in verse 18 constitutes a formal call for Hagar to perform the caring office that she had moments earlier abandoned into some other hand, in effect to reclaim her maternal relation to Ishmael. So come, or literally stand up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, which is quite a long description here. As my note below says, some here is picking up the baby, but also fitting with the lifting out of the brambles from his weakened condition. And notice how lifting him out of the bush will parallel the ram being lifted out of the bush as a substitute for Isaac in the next chapter. And hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. And we saw in verse 13 it said, I will make him a nation in the Hebrew, but the Septuagint added great. Here the Hebrew adds it as well. And as Megan Warner notes below, a foundational promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12:2 is extended to Ishmael, is never extended to Isaac. And that's again part of the point we've been looking at, that there'll be no Isaac cycle at all. And Jacob will have a nation. He'll have 12 sons who become the 12 tribal elders that become the nation of Israel. But Isaac is caught in between. And so with the command from the angel, then new things happen. And of course, the seeing of the well is parallel to seeing the ram. And then God opened her eyes, recalling the opening of eyes in the Garden of Eden, and another connection with Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel, noting that John's Gospel is framing this around her as well as around the Song of Songs, but that's for another series. So God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Be'er Mayim. In the Septuagint, though, it becomes Frer Hodatas Zoantas, a well of living water, one of a number of links, also in John's Gospel, between Hagar and the Samaritan woman there, and also overtones into 4:15 of the Song of Songs as a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And as Sonic, who wrote an entire doctoral dissertation on this scene, suggests, immediately or promptly filled, so noting the hurry of it, it's left out in the translation, and gave the boy a drink. That filling will also be parallel to Rebecca at the well in chapter 24, filling enough so the camels can drink. And so that ends the chiasm, and we see no response from Hagar to all this, even though she responded in the scene we looked at in the chapter 16 with naming Yahweh El Roi and the rhetorical question, have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? She has no response to this miraculous rescue here, or to the promise that her son will be a great nation. And we don't even hear what happens to her. We hear, as the narrator takes us, simply about Ishmael. So let's leave the chiasm and finish our scene with these last couple of verses, and then we'll look briefly at some artistic images of this powerful scene. So God was with the boy, like God is with Samuel, one of many parallels to the Samuel story, and especially the early parts with Hannah, as we saw in the last video and we're seeing now. And he grew up. So suddenly time is telescoped here to adult Ishmael. And he lived in the wilderness, paralleling where they were in the wilderness. And I noted in the previous, when I looked at the video on chapter 16, this description that sounds negative here can easily be interpreted that he's independent of control of other people. And one of the ways he can do that is by becoming an expert with the bow, which is another thing that connects it with the David story, because in 1 Samuel 20, we see David and Jonathan making an arrangement by shooting arrows, the only time there are arrows in that whole book. So there's just another one of these connections that we can connect Ishmael with David. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, noting another little ABA chiasm, just as we saw the one about hearing the voice up there. Lived in the wilderness, and became an expert with the bow. And then we hear the only thing we hear about Hagar here. His mother got a wife from him from the land of Egypt. And if we're going to look at the atlas here, we can see, we looked at the Google Maps version, but here's the wilderness of Beersheba somewhere in this area, but she has to go all the way down here to Egypt to get a wife from him, unless there's a passing Egyptian, which is to say there was a woman who's from Egypt that shows up there, but we don't hear that. It really suggests she goes all the way to Egypt. But curiously, it doesn't say she settles there. And this will parallel as Abraham will look home to Mesopotamia in chapter 24 for Isaac's wife. She looks to have him, at least in some way, be part of her ethnic group. But of course, Abraham is her father, and he's not an Egyptian. So Hagar will always be of mixed blood for those who are counting those sorts of things. So let's finish this off with looking a little bit of art, and we'll just do it briefly so you can see how artists have tried to portray this difficult scene. So the oldest one, the more traditional Renaissance-y looking one, is from Benjamin West from 1703, and you see the angel looking a traditional way an angel looks in Renaissance art. But now we see some that are different. This one from Jean-Francois Millet from 1849, with the bare-breasted Hagar, both of them looking hot and dying there in the desert, a very stark image. This one from Luigi Alois Giarduzzi, just 2 years later in 1851, with Hagar again looking a little bit disheveled here in the desert, although looking a little bit sensual and erotic perhaps as well, which is a surprising scene for someone with their son dying in the desert of thirst. This one from 3 decades later, 1883, from Emmanuel Crescent's Liska. And this one struck me because of the darkness there. I assume that's sunset. That's not the moon. It's too big to be the moon, but the darkness of them lying in the desert in the dark. And then finally, this one from George Hitchcock. It's undated, but from the late 19th century, showing them softly among the bushes. And I think all of these in ways that most of the ones we showed last time with the scene of kicking them out, of casting them out, which looked very much like Renaissance worlds other than the R. Crumb one. These artists really tried to capture the stark nature of this woman and her son being in the desert. So next video we'll shift radically back to Abimelech, but that will complete the chiasm of these two chapters and set up the terrifying parallel to this scene of the binding of Isaac known as the Akedah. See you then for that. Bye-bye.